Welcome all to our magnificent campus. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeremy Paul. I'm the dean here at the law school, and I can sense a palpable excitement in the room in anticipation of the lecture about to be delivered by this spring's Dave Pitney Distinguished Visiting Scholar, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Bob Woodward. Only members of the news media have expressed disappointment that Donald Trump was not available. This is truly a crescendo event for us in this marvelous spring, and I'm deeply grateful to the Dave Pitney Foundation for making it possible. The Dave Pitney Visiting Scholar Program has added immeasurably to the quality of discussion on campus. Under its auspices, we have welcomed Justices Antonin Scalia and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, New York City Schools Chancellor Joel Klein, noted human rights lawyer Sherry Blair, and just this past fall, U.S. Court of Appeals Judge Denny Chin. We also catch people early, and we hosted Harvard professor Kathleen Sullivan before she became Stanford Law School's dean, and University of Virginia's professor Saul Levmore before he became dean at the University of Chicago. Who knows what honors await other Dave Pitney scholars? The chance for our campus to hear from leading thinkers in a variety of fields is one of the things that transforms our law school from a place to earn a degree into a place to get an education, and we are grateful for it. Today, I would like to single out two contributors that make events such as this possible. The first, of course, is the Dave Pitney Foundation. Tomorrow is my 4th anniversary as dean, and if I have learned anything at all during that time, it is that private support has been and will increasingly become the backbone of our aspirations for excellence. We are generously supported by the state, as our beautiful facilities and strong faculty and staff attest. But if we wish to remain the law school of choice for aspiring lawyers whose ambition extends across the nation and around the globe, we will depend on generous partners such as the Dave Pitney Foundation to offer the sort of world-class experience we will receive today. Please join me in a round of applause for our friends at the Dave Pitney Foundation. Second, I'd like to thank Dan Gorin, Editor-in-Chief of the Law Review, not simply for his pivotal role in bringing Mr. Woodward here today, but also as a representative of the work done by so many students around campus. This spring, students have assumed leadership roles in bringing us oral arguments by the Second Circuit, in hosting Ken Feinberg at a symposium on litigation involving large numbers, in attracting leading civil rights scholar Derek Bell, in welcoming the Director of the Patent and Trademark Office, David Kapos, and in orchestrating countless programs too numerous to mention. I have watched carefully as students have picked up the baton, managed logistics with wisdom and judgment, and truly understood that their work reflects upon us all. This sort of learning by doing is an important complement to our clinical programs in transforming aspiring students into newly minted professionals. For me, the pride students so evidently display in events such as Mr. Woodward's lecture today is a crucial part of our educational experience. And for this reason, more even than the favorable publicity we will receive, I am doubly grateful to the Dave Pitney Foundation for making it possible. Now, let me introduce to you attorney and former state senator Sam Kajigeri, who is here representing our friends at the Dave Pitney Foundation. Mr. Kajigeri is a partner in the law firm of Dave Pitney, LLP, where he represents clients in matters involving the intersection of complex business and regulatory issues. He handles a wide variety of matters, but focuses particularly on insurance regulation and transactions. He told me earlier today that he used to teach a course here in insurance regulation. He has also been a noted public servant, having been a member of the state senate from 2007 to 2011, former acting mayor of the city of Waterbury, and a candidate for Congress in Connecticut's 5th Congressional District. Attorney Kajigeri is a graduate of Boston College, holds his Master of Arts in Religion from Yale University, and his JD from Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. We are honored to have him with us today and grateful to him for representing the Dave Pitney Foundation on this exciting occasion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Paul, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Dave Pitney and the Dave Pitney Foundation, I wanted to take a moment to say thank you for being part of this very special event this morning. I'd like to thank our friends at the University of Connecticut School of Law, at the Connecticut Law Review, for giving us the opportunity to be able to continue to partner with you in providing one of the finest legal educations in this country, and in particular, in being able to provide the symposium that you're all here to participate in this morning. Day Pitney feels very strongly that it's one of our duties and obligations as members of the bar to contribute in various ways to the public good. One of the ways that we do that is to encourage the exchange of ideas, especially when those ideas have an impact on the laws under which we all live. It is a particular honor for us to have Bob Woodward as our guest here this morning, because it is very hard, for me at least, to imagine many people who exceed his ability and contributions through his work as a journalist to have shaped the laws under which we live, and in particular, the relationship of those laws to government and politics. And that's why it is an especially high honor for us to be able to be a part of this outstanding program along with all of you and the University of Connecticut this morning. And with that, I want to thank you once again for being a part of this very special event. Mr. Woodward, I'd like to thank you for honoring us with your presence this morning. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dan Gorin, who will make the formal introduction of our very special guest this morning. Dan?
Welcome, and thanks for coming today. I also want to thank the Day Pitney Foundation for so generously supporting this event. We really couldn't do it without them. I also want to thank Dean Paul and Julia Dunlop, Michelle Hellman for helping us organize this event. And of course, our symposium editors, Megan LaFountain and Kate Shea, who have worked tirelessly to put this together. Before coming to law school, I was a reporter for 10 years. When I first started out in newspapers at a small weekly paper in Somerville, Massachusetts, I called my father, who had been an assistant U.S. attorney in Washington, D.C., and asked him if he knew any journalists that I could contact to give me advice about climbing up in the world of newspapers. He gave me the name of a prominent journalist in Washington, D.C., who worked for the Washington Post, named Elsa Walsh. For the first few months of my career, I would call Elsa at her home, and she gave me invaluable advice that I'll never forget. But during those months when I would call, every so often, some guy would answer the phone, and I'd ask for Elsa, and he would pass her the phone. One of those occasions, I asked him who it was, and he said it was Bob. Now, I can't explain why my father hadn't told me that Elsa Walsh is married to Bob Woodward. I can say that as a Cub newspaper reporter, the discovery was quite a shock, and that I don't think I was able to string together a coherent sentence during that brief conversation. I also certainly learned a good journalistic lesson, which is to know something about the person that you're calling before you actually call them. But to this day, I remember the brief conversation because of the advice that Mr. Woodward gave to me before taking a message for Elsa. He said that he still cherished the early period in his career as a journalist, and that I should tackle my time as a new reporter with honesty, integrity, and enthusiasm. All the experiences and excitement would be fresh, he said, and all the lessons would be all that much more rewarding because they'd be hard-earned. And I believe as many of us start out in our new careers as lawyers, that advice is actually very relevant to us today. Mr. Woodward does not require my introduction. He's regarded as one of America's preeminent investigative reporters and nonfiction authors. He's worked for the Washington Post since 1971 and is today an associate editor at the Post. In 1972, he was teamed up with Carl Bernstein, and the two did most of the original news reporting on the Watergate scandal that led to numerous government investigations and the eventual resignation of President Richard Nixon. The work has been described as perhaps the single greatest reporting effort of all time. He has authored 16 nonfiction books, 12 of which have been national bestsellers. It is my true honor to introduce Bob Woodward.
nice to be here, and you don't remember when you called and we talked that first time, the other piece of advice I gave you was, don't go to law school. At the Washington Post, we have a saying, which is, all good work is done in defiance of management. And all good work is done in defiance of advice from older people. It's great to talk with a bunch of lawyers. My father was a lawyer in Illinois, a small town outside of Chicago called Wheaton, and ever since I can remember, age 4 or 5, my father would always say, the lawyers are the pillars of the community. They are the wisest, most significant people, and always they have the most profound things to say, unless you listen very carefully. Really good advice. And I could tell all kinds of lawyer stories, but one of my favorites goes back to the 1980s when I was working on the CIA and intelligence issues during the Reagan administration. And we bumped into some really sensitive covert operations. It was in the middle of the Cold War. And the White House, the Reagan White House, and Bill Casey, who was the CIA director, didn't want us to publish lots of these things. They were threatening us with prosecution. And in the course of this, I went to see my lawyer, Ed Williams, Edward Bennett Williams, famous criminal lawyer in DC. It was on a Saturday morning. I remember going to see Ed, and he represented the Washington Post, and he was a personal lawyer for me also. And we started to talk, and he said, no, wait a minute, I need to tell you something. I am also the general counsel to President Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and I represent Bill Casey, the CIA director, personally. And I said, Ed, now let's see, you represent me, you represent the Post, you represent the President, you represent the CIA director. Isn't there embedded in here some sort of conflict? And he leaned back and he said, I like to represent the situation. Every lawyer's dream. And what is really interesting in the case of Ed Williams, what he did, this was as sensitive as negotiations get between the government and the press, because there were things that we did not write about. I couldn't even write, I could, as you know, because there's no prior restraint, but shouldn't write about even today in 2011. And what Ed did as a kind of judge, he looked at the interests of the government, the CIA, the Post, and journalism informing the public, and helped us all kind of work through the woods on this, and we published lots of the stories, so the public was informed in a way that I think was appropriate, namely that the CIA had declared an intelligence war against the Soviet Union and terrorists, and that sometimes it was going over the line, some actions were taken that were high risk, and the public should know. At the same time, some of the wiring diagrams and so forth were not published. 6 years ago, it was 2005, I was at a conference in Colorado with my wife, Elsa, and one of the dinners, I was seated next to Al Gore, the former vice president. Now, dinner sitting next to Al Gore is taxing. Now, let's be honest. It's unpleasant. Whether you like Gore, dislike him, agree or disagree, he's a hammer. And I've written 2 of my 4 books on President Bush and his wars, and I remember Gore saying, well, now why have you not come out against President Bush in the Iraq War? And I said, in journalism, we're evidence-driven and really trying to find out what happened and not to take a position. And he said, horse manure. During Watergate, you and Carl Bernstein wrote those stories, and you came out against Nixon and out against what had happened. And I said, no, if you read them carefully, we tried to stick to the facts. And he said, look, in his very, contained, emotionally controlled way, look, I read those stories. I know what they said. And I said, I wrote those stories. Didn't move his, on the meter of self-doubt, 0. His reading was more important than my writing. And if you go back, there's a clue to this. Before Gore became a politician, he was a journalist. And he thinks he invented that also. And so he was really into me about the business and about Bush. And my attitude was, look, he lost to Bush in 2000 in a way that was certainly debatable and questionable. And so, he could have at it. And he did. And I kept driving at the question, how much do we, let's find out what happened. Let's be evidence-driven. And simply asked him, how much of what went on in the Clinton White House when you were the vice president do we now know, 5 years after you left? The endless books, 24/7 coverage, the Monica Lewinsky Whitewater investigations, daily coverage. So how much of what went on of consequence or interest in those 8 years do we now know in 2005? And he said 1%. And having written about Clinton and him and so forth, I kind of died inside, only 1%. And have to confess to having a very unclean thought. And that is when he said 1%, I thought, is it possible there are that many women we don't know about? Think about it, if it's only 1%, there's a big number there someplace. But I didn't ask him that, and then said, well, suppose you wrote all you know. Then what would we know? What percentage would we know? He said he'd never write a tell-all memoir. Suppose you did, hypothetically. Then how much would we know? And he said 2%. Now, that's the challenge in journalism. I mean, imagine working on a case where you were told you're only going to have 1 or 2% of the information. Now, I think Gore's being ornery in his charming way, and I think we know more, but how do you develop a method as a journalist to increase that percentage, make it authoritative? And when I work on these books, my goal is to, from the method, seek testimony, evidence from first-hand witnesses, get contemporaneous notes, get documents, do a draft, go back, try to figure out what happened. The last book I did is Obama's Wars, which came out last fall, and it focuses on the Afghanistan war and secret war in Pakistan, the war on terror. And I picked that because in the campaign, Obama said he would add resources to the Afghan war, going way back to covering Nixon and Vietnam War is the real measure of a president, in my view. War is the act of state. When we decide to go to war with somebody, it's the most serious thing we can do. I think you travel abroad, it defines who we are to the rest of the world, and in many, maybe more important ways, it defines who we are to ourselves. War is at the center of, and Obama realizes this emotionally and intellectually, I believe. But what I did in working on that interviewed people, got contemporaneous notes in Obama's wars. There are literally tens of thousands of words from top secret White House meetings, private conversations, Oval Office discussions that have not been public, that excavates and shows the road Obama walked in making the decisions in these wars. And it's one of the, if you, quite honestly, at one point I was going to call the book The Divided Man, because Obama doesn't like war, and you read through it, and repeatedly at these top secret meetings he's saying, I want a plan to get out of Afghanistan. I am not going to spend $1 trillion on this war. Our focus has got to be the domestic issues. As you know, he was an opponent of the Iraq War. At the same time, he realizes for political purposes, for kind of campaign commitments and the commitments of the country, he inherited these wars. We were heading out of Iraq, allegedly, and he said he would do more in the Afghan war. So he's caught in this, you know, how do you balance? And as a lawyer, as a former law professor, he knows how to balance. Whether he comes up with the right answers or not, you don't know. But you see the power of the military, military-industrial complex, of Gates, the defense secretary, the generals, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen. Literally, in these meetings, Obama's saying, I want options, I want alternatives. And the military said, well, we think there's only one way to do this. And they thwart him, they push back. They will not give him alternatives. Finally, Vice President Biden develops an alternative for the big troop decision. The military wanted 40,000 more troops. Biden's plan was for 20,000 more troops. What did Obama in the end pick? 30,000, right in the middle. If you want to understand Obama on anything, in a negative way, he's a compromiser. In a positive way, he takes the two or the many views and comes up with something that is at the reasonable center. Whether that works, whether that's going to be good, we're going to see. These things depend on outcomes. But the idea is to intensively look at data. If I taught a class in journalism sometime, it would be a class in empiricism. How do you get the facts? How do you verify? Where is there doubt? When there is doubt, say there is doubt. In the course of doing that book, I interviewed Obama last summer and went through, and he validated the key stages of his decision-making over 18 months in Afghanistan. It became very clear he doesn't like war. He said war is managing chaos. And at the end, while he's trying to get me out of the Oval Office, which he was doing, I know I had reached a certain point, and he said, okay, we're done. And I said, well, there are more questions. And in classic law professor style, he said, well, there are always more questions. And he got up and started to walk out, and I figured it would not be appropriate to stay. But that was my inclination. And as we're walking out, he said, you have better sources than I do, which is horse manure. That's not true. And I said, no, that can't be the case. I've had 18 months to focus on one thing that's only part of the presidency. And then he said, have you ever thought of being head of the CIA? And I said, no, and I realized that was not a job offer. And he said, it was not. But when we're standing outside the Oval Office, I handed him a quote about, from a World War II history, one of the great histories, in which it's a book called The Day of Battle, about the Sicilian Italian campaign in World War II by a former colleague of mine, Rick Atkinson. And Rick writes about war in general at one point, almost poetically, and says, look, war it corrupts everyone, from the private to the general to the commander-in-chief, the head of state, that in war, it is the business of killing. No heart goes unstained. And so Obama reads this and said, I'm sympathetic to that view. Go read my Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which I'd heard and read, but I went back and reread it, and there it is. He says that war is never glorious. Never glorious. I'm reading a Churchill biography now, and at one point during World War I, Churchill said, war is glorious and delicious. That's Winston Churchill. Here's Obama saying it's never glorious. He said sometimes it's necessary, but it is always a manifestation of human folly. And I think that's true. At the same time, so you see the anti-war impulse, and then the responsibilities and commitments, commander-in-chief. So these two ideas are roommates, if you will, in his mind, and his mind is full of, there are lots of roommates in his mind. He has lots of ideas. He tries to come up with some reasonable decision. Whether those are going to be the right decisions or not, we don't know. And that is the real question. I remember Karl Rove, who was George Bush's chief political advisor. I was talking with him about the wars, the Iraq War and so on. He said, look, all these things are determined by outcome, and I think that's true, and we don't know what the outcome is. One other point I wanted to make is, we were talking about this because you're in the legal business or about to be lawyers before with the dean and Dan Gorin. This is an old story about lawyering, but it told me a lot, and this was during the Watergate era. It was early 1974, Nixon had not yet resigned. John Mitchell, who was Nixon's attorney general, his campaign manager, probably the person closest to him, had been indicted in Watergate, was about to go on trial for the Watergate cover-up, and I was at the Post on a Sunday morning, and the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Martha Mitchell. Now, anyone remember who Martha Mitchell was? Was the alcoholic, crazy wife of John Mitchell. And she said, hello, Bob. I talked to her a couple of times, and she had some insights into what was going on. She said to me, well, the bastard finally left. And what do you mean? He said, well, he walked out on me. They lived at an apartment on 5th Avenue, New York, and so he's gone, and why don't you, and she always called Carl Bernstein, Mr. Bernstein, why don't you and Mr. Bernstein get on the shuttle and come on up here because he left all his papers in his office. Wow. Now, let's ask, what do you do? What do you do? I'm asking you. What's your first, somebody, raise your hand. You don't have to be a lawyer to answer. What would you do? What? Call your lawyer. Okay. Who was Ed Williams, right? And we called Ed and said, we've got this invitation to come up and fleece John Mitchell's office. And he took the position, he said, well, he's effectively abandoned the material as if he's left it out on the sidewalk in 5th Avenue for the garbage people to come by. So get on the shuttle and go. So we went, and I remember going knocking on the apartment door, and there's Martha Mitchell with a double martini, and it was early afternoon at that point, and said, come on in, there's his office. I hope you really get the guy. And so we went through the files and found some really interesting stories. I mean, one of them was a letter that the head of a big drug company had written John Mitchell saying, we have trouble with the SEC. If you help us with the problems, I'll give $100,000 to the Nixon campaign. Now, people don't write things down like that anymore, but unfortunately. But you never saw, you know, here's quid pro quo. Help us with the SEC problems. It was Elmer Boast who ran one of the big drug companies. We will give, I remember the language, $100,000 to the 72 fray, 72 campaign. In the files were Mitchell's handwritten notes as he was preparing for his trial. And so we started writing a bunch of stories based on these documents and notes. And of course, we protect our sources, so we did not tell the public that our source was the angry wife. It might have not been something we wanted to disclose. As you find out in my business, often whistleblowers, even who give you the truth, are characters you don't necessarily want to embrace, but and you have to test what they say fully, but they often are people you don't want to say, oh yeah, this is our source. So we started running these stories. Bill Hundley, who's deceased, as is Mitchell, he was Mitchell's lawyer, a famous defense lawyer, called me up and said, I remember picking up the phones, and I knew him well enough, and he said, I know the bitch gave them to you. And I said, of course, we don't discuss sources, and he said, oh, come on, it's me. And I said, look, we don't discuss sources. And he said, look, these documents are from his office, particularly the attorney-client work product, really notes preparing himself for the trial. He said, you've got to be fair-minded here, not just be a journalist. And if those papers are not back delivered to my office by 3 p.m. today, I'm going to Judge Sirica in filing a motion that you be held in contempt and be forced to turn over these documents. Now, they're another decision point. What do? Call your lawyer. No, you don't. I'm sitting there. This is a time when the press, particularly those of it, the Washington Post, were kind of full of self-regard, if I may be candid, and you know, we're tough and no one pushes us around. And I didn't want to have a fight, a legal fight, over whether we should be using these papers from the angry wife. And I looked at it, and what Hundley said, he didn't say don't Xerox them. So we Xeroxed all the papers. They were on his desk by 3 p.m. and no one knew. Not the editors, not the lawyers. And it was a reasonable, fair-minded resolution. We could still do our job. We lost nothing. And if you were a lawyer for John Mitchell in a case like that, you would want to know what's out there that some reporter has that maybe is going to contradict his sworn testimony and so forth. Of course, so much of his sworn testimony had already been contradicted by the tapes and so forth. He was quite vulnerable. But that is a case of trying to solve the problem without a conflict. Now, the last thing before we get to questions, and we're going to have a microphone for question, wanted to mention my wife Elsa and I were at a panel that was held some years ago, and the subject was aging. They had some of the real aging experts. I'm 69 now, 68 now, and it's a subject that interests me a whole lot. And they had physicians and psychologists, some of the best people on aging, and James Watson, who was the co-discoverer of DNA, was on the panel. And they're talking about the consequences of aging, how you control it, you can't reverse it, but you can help yourself, and so forth. Quite interesting. And Watson doesn't say anything, nothing, sitting there just for an hour. Now, you know the power of silence in a courtroom in human interaction and so forth, and they were kind of, you know, what's Watson think? He's the guy who's the smartest, he has a Nobel Prize and so forth. And finally the moderator says, Dr. Watson, what do you think? What's the best way to deal with aging? And he looks up and he says, the only way to deal with aging is stay away from old people. Nailed it. Then they handed out sheets of paper to everyone about your own lifestyle, in which you could score from your lifestyle, and you would get points, or points would be taken away, and you'd add it all up, and it would tell you roughly how many years you have to live. Now, how many people here are kind of interested in the idea of how many years you have to live? Everyone. It's universal. So this is a big deal. And it asks questions like, how many times do you exercise? Did you ever smoke? Personal question, how many bowel movements a week do you have? You know, really the whole medical history. And Elsa and I are sitting behind Henry Kissinger, who was Nixon and Ford's Secretary of State National Security Advisor. So Elsa, being a journalist, and we believe in transparency, and so we let's see how Henry's doing on this contest. And he was into this, you know, like everyone is. I wish I had some of the form. It's a great example of looking at yourself, and you know, the answer is informative, to say the least. So he adds it all up, and turns out he died 4 years ago. Henry, not happy at all, just bouncing in his chair, looking at this, and you know, everyone's looking around and sort of say, yeah, I've got 10 years to live. You know, he's not saying anything. So what does he do? He decides to open diplomatic relations with the questions. And he gets out his eraser, and turns out last time he ate red meat was 1949. He does all of these, and he literally erases and rescores. And gets down to the end, and turns out he has 8 years to live. Now, I tell that story because that's what, particularly if you read Kissinger's 3 volumes of history in the Nixon and Ford administrations, it is a massive rescoring. And that every time in journalism you were confronted with rescoring, that in working on the 4 Bush books, working on any of these books, working on the book Scott Armstrong and I did on the Supreme Court, The Brethren, you find that if you get documentary evidence, if you get notes, you get conference votes and so forth, and turns out 5 of the sitting justices helped us on that book secretly, that people will try to readjust. And by working on these books on Obama's wars, I was able to interview key people, sometimes within hours after key decision points in meetings, sometimes days later, and then 6 months later you go, well, what happened? Oh, my position, here, you're rescoring. And there is this effort to rescore history and policy making always. And you see it, and the apparatus that exists in the government is so strong and has such capacity to control the message. And I would argue that there's more concentration of power and message control in the White House. It's just been increasing over the years, since the Nixon years. Clinton was better than Bush Sr., that Bush, George W. Bush, Bush Jr. got better at trying to control the message. And Obama is incredibly, has people whose lives are devoted to controlling the message. This is the story. And so it is a real, you can't do this, and this is my big argument with the current media environment, which is driven by impatience and speed, that you have to be patient and you have to be slow, and you have to peel the onion to get to what really happened. And it's hard, and of course the news organizations have less money, and so it's much more difficult. When, if we were to talk about what's the thing we worry about the most, certainly the economy, wars, the environment, healthcare, the deficit, and we made a list, we'd be here all day. My answer to the question what we should worry about the most is simple. It's secret government. That's what will do us in. All the other problems, monumental as they seem, that the resilience and energy capacity of people in this country is really limitless. But if we have secret government, that's what Nixon tried, a group of people getting together and say, we have the ball, we have the power, we're going to do it our way. And if you listen to the Nixon tapes, regularly the president ordering illegal activity, abusive activity. But the real haunting story in the Nixon administration, the Nixon tapes, is, and I've listened to, read transcripts of not all of them because it would take a lifetime to do that, but what is so interesting is the dog that never barks on those tapes. What no one ever says, Nixon is close aides, no one ever says what would be good for the country, what is right, what is it we need. It was always about Nixon. Let's use the power of the presidency as an instrument of personal revenge or reward for people who had been Nixon supporters. And so that the ultimate failure of the Nixon presidency is not connecting that power of that office, which is astronomical. There's concentration of power in the presidency, which we really don't even understand now, to the greater good for a majority of people. And you can criticize, and I have, and I would, all of the presidents after Nixon for one thing or another. But what you find in a Clinton, in a George Bush, and Obama, is they're trying, they do ask the question, what's good? What would work for the people? What would be the right thing to do? So whoever said about secret government got it right, that democracies die in darkness. It's that simple. And if we shut out the light, that will imperil our democracy. Last story, years ago I was, after I'd finished one of my books, the head of Simon & Schuster, which has published them all, took me to dinner in New York City, and I thought, oh boy, dinner with the boss, this is great. And just the two of us. And he sat down, he said, okay, what's your next book? And I said, well, I want to do some thinking, reporting, reading. He said, what? Thinking, reporting, reading? Why are you going to waste your time? And I said, well, that's what I tried to do. He said, no, no. We are in the marketing business, the product delivery business. You're one of our authors. We need to know right now what your next book is. And I thought this was preposterous. And he's one of these people who just grinds on you. Whatever would come up, he would say, oh, maybe you could do a book about that. What about this? Just grind. You know people like this. You may work for somebody like that. You may be married to somebody like that. It's a marvelous capacity to always get back to what is on their mind. So after a number of hours of being ground on, I finally said, well, I figured out what my next book is going to be. And he said, at last, good. What? I said, my next book will be an expose of the publishing industry in New York City. And he, instead of vetoing it, he smiled. He said, that's terrific. I have a great title for you. I said, I don't think there are any great titles left. He said, there's one. What? Your book on an expose on the publishing business will be called My Last Book. sincere thing he's ever said. And if you look at a list of books I've written, it's not there, but I'm going to get to it someday. Thanks so much. Let's stop and move on. Now, the only good questions are hard ones, okay? So.
We're going to take.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah, it's burning.
Gordon Liddy has supplied the microphone.
Can everybody hear me in the back? Okay, good. We're going to take questions from the floor, but the key is that you actually have to come up here and take the microphone because we can't move the microphones past those speakers. So, if you have questions, please come up.
Get in line, or you can take it from there. Thank you. Good.
Stay there.
Thank you. Hi. Tell me who you are. And
My name's Steve Parrish. I'm married to a lawyer, and I'm a journalist.
okay. Oh boy, that's fun.
It's fun, right? Most of the time. What do you think about the prosecution of Bradley Manning?
Is that what? Hard? Yeah, that's a hard case. That's a hard thing. The government has to try to protect its secrets. There's no question about it. But the madness of having some private, allegedly, I emphasize allegedly, who has access to hundreds of thousands of secret documents. I mean, what, you know, that's in a sense the story, the madness. Much has been made of WikiLeaks. I think they're important, they're interesting. The question you always ask when you're trying to look at government decision making is a document or a personality, does that person have standing with the decision maker? The WikiLeaks secret documents, mid-level classification, they rarely, if ever, get to the White House. The White House has its own intelligence channels and so forth, top secret documents, and they have better, not definitive information as we know, but better information, at least they think it is. So the New York Times put out a statement when they started running the WikiLeaks documents saying these documents will tell you how the biggest, most important decisions are made in government. That's not true. They are background music. The real decisions are made in the Obama White House, in the White House by the president and his staff. It's a White House-centric operation. So you were talking about, I know I've often had stories where somebody at the mid-level will say, oh, we're planning this and there's a contingency plan for invading Mexico. And wow, that's great. And then you go and did it ever get to the White House? No, it has no standing in the White House. So the WikiLeaks are important, but not going to go down in the history books, quite frankly. The government has to prosecute somebody. They have evidence. They think this has been leaked. Now to put him is allegedly has been done, you know, where he was in a cell without clothes and so forth. You know, there's a humane way to do that. The government should know better. Maybe they've changed how they're handling him and so forth. But you have to. I can understand the government prosecuting that. I've had sources on Obama's wars, top secret SCI information, special compartmented information, most sensitive information in the government. I take it, and my supposition is I'm going to use it, but I test it with people, and if they say don't run this for the following reasons, I don't. On Obama's wars, I had 10 really sensitive intelligence issues, and I took them to the key people and went through the list, and like one of them was the CIA has a secret 3,000-man army in Afghanistan of Afghans who were on the payroll. It's an incredibly potent force. And they said, oh no, don't run that, you know, and I said, look, I'm not gonna name who is in the army, who runs it, where they're located, where they operate, but the public needs to know. We're making this commitment in Afghanistan. If we had a secret army in Afghanistan before 9/11, they would have gotten bin Laden. They never would have, we never probably would have had 9/11. So public needs to know that, so I published that. There was an item, number 10 on the list, and I went through it, and blood drained from the face. It said, if you publish that, there will be serious repercussions. I asked on the Richter scale, from 0 to 10, what is it? And they said a 9. That's high. That's Japanese earthquake. And they made their arguments, and that people would be killed, and it would have an incredible disruptive effect on a number of things. And I bought those arguments. It's not in the book. So you have to weigh with your sources. The beauty of this, quite frankly, is the Pentagon Papers decision. They can't stop me from publishing something. They can take action afterwards if they want to come after me. But so what the Pentagon Papers, in a practical sense, is opened a negotiating channel with the government when you have sensitive information. The New York Times did that on the WikiLeaks case, and I think educated the WikiLeaks people to vet, not just wholesale publish documents that may get people killed. Long answer, sorry. You gotta come up to the front. Lawyers with no questions. Go ahead.
It's a big question.
Good.
Can you talk a little bit about the future of the sort of states? There's a lot of talk about investigative journalism not having enough funding and sort of dying. And speak a little bit about that as part of this.
Yeah, we're going through a convulsion in the news media, and my suspicion is that we're going to miss something really important, and the country collectively is going to return to its senses, and the people like Google and Facebook who have all the money are going to realize they're going to not just take content from other people. Google takes all the advertising from people, and then they get the free content from the Washington Post and the New York Times and the Boston Globe and you name it. Just because having a good, solid information system is vital. This is the democracy's die in darkness. So I think we're going to a bad period. But let me tell a story that goes way back about, that addresses the question of risk when you take on a difficult story in journalism. The risk rests, and I'm talking about Watergate. Carl Bernstein and I, 29, 30 years old, were working on this story. I just started in journalism. If it turned out that our Watergate information wasn't accurate, Carl could have gone to review rock music, which he always wanted to do, and I could have done something like go to law school. The risk was on the head of Katharine Graham, who was the publisher of the Washington Post. And I just want to set the scene because it's an extraordinary story about her willingness to take risk, which I think is at the core of how the news media functions. We've got to be willing to take risk. And that doesn't mean you gamble or anyway. She supported, we wrote these stories in 1972. The central reality was they were not believed by our colleagues at the Washington Post. Were kind of looking, those people over there, conventional wisdom, Nixon's too smart to be involved in this. As we later learned, one of the Nixon strategies was to get people to challenge the FCC television licenses that the Washington Post company owned. And so the stock had just gone public, so the stock was in the toilet. The journalistic reputation of the Washington Post was at least on the rim of the toilet. Katharine Graham invited me up for lunch. And I remember going in, and I met her, and she'd supported this, but I didn't really have conversations with her. And this is January '73. Nixon had just won a landslide victory. People didn't believe Watergate. It was kind of, it's over. And sat down, and she started quizzing me about Watergate, and literally blew my mind with what she knew about the case. I later described this management style, which I think applies to every institution in business. Mind on, hands off. you need to be intellectually involved, know what's going on in the law school, but you can't tell people how to teach. They have to do it, and you have to get people who will do it. She was a master at knowing what's going on, but not telling us how to edit or report. I remember at one point in this lunch, she said, oh, I was reading about Watergate in the Chicago Tribune. I remember thinking, Chicago Tribune? What's she reading the damn Chicago Tribune for? No one in Chicago does, even then. But she was scooping it up, it was data. And at the end, she asked the killer question, like a great CEO and publisher, and that was, when are we going to find out the whole truth about Watergate? And I said that Carl and I felt, because it was a criminal conspiracy, they compartmentalized information. When we went to see people, they were frightened, that the stakes were so high, the political stakes, that the White House had political control to a large extent of the Justice Department and the investigation. So my answer, when all the truth was going to come out, was never. I remember looking across the lunch table, and she had this wounded, stricken look on her face. You never want to see a face look like that on your boss's face. And looked at me and when I said never, and she said the following: never? Don't tell me never. I left the lunch a highly motivated employee. But the never, don't tell me never was not a threat. And this is it was a statement of purpose. What she said was, use all your resources, use all the resources of this newspaper. You've already used a portion of its reputation to get to the bottom of this. This is what we do in our business. The risk, I don't care about the risk. Go to it. You have the total backing. Not only is that the obligation of journalism, but in this story, the evidence we have is that there is a massive criminal conspiracy in the White House, and the consequences of that for the country go way beyond journalism. So in that, to work in that environment is incredibly liberating. You've got the boss who says, you know, go to it, use all your resources, and dig, 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 peel the onion. And someday we're going to put a plaque in the lobby of the Washington Post, and we're going to bolt it in so no one can take it out. And it's going to simply be, quote mark, never, don't tell me never, end quote. Catherine Graham, January 1973. She understood what the business is about. There are people who still do. They don't have the resources that she had when the Post was, really was printing money with the monopoly we had and so forth. But there are enough people out there who get it. But the danger to the country is giant. And if you look at all of the war issues, national security issues, the debt issues, the finance issues, I talked to somebody at the Treasury Department recently about the financial crisis. And I said, now tell me about the financial crisis. Do we know what happened? He said, yes, we know what happened, but we don't know what caused it. What? And I asked somebody else and said, oh yeah, we know what caused it, but we don't know what happened. Now that's, somebody better look at that. Still, even though books have been written, what really happened? And what caused it? We don't know the answer to that. Okay, next. Somebody brave.
The microphones don't work, so you just have to shout.
Oh, okay, good. Go ahead, yes.
I'm Bob Woodward, I'm dean of pharmacy. So
A pharmacist. Oh, wow. Right.
I have a question for you. How big of a role do you think underlying racism playing in some of the criticism of the president?
Okay, an interesting question from the dean of the pharmacy school. That, America runs on pills. I mean, really. I I mean, the more money is spent on prescription drugs than in hospitals now. Right, amazing. Anyway, let's talk afterwards. He probably has more important stories than anyone in the room. The question was about undertow of racism in the criticism of Obama. I don't think it's there that much. It certainly isn't talked about. With certain people, it may be a factor, and but you know, in a way, I think the cheerful news, we seem to have moved beyond that. That the criticism of him is the in substance and so forth. Now, and somebody ought to examine this whole birth certificate issue, which leads to the question of Donald Trump. But this is where I have problems with the news media. You interview Donald Trump, and he says, "Oh, we're looking at Obama's birth certificate, and people who are looking at it really are finding some shocking things." I mean, this is McCarthyism, because the journalist then never says, "Well, what?" And if they say what, he said, "Oh, they're working on it, and there are all kinds of questions and so forth." And I've looked at the birth certificate issue. I mean, look at the evidence. Just, stick to the facts. The head of Vital Statistics in Hawaii has put out a statement, he's a Republican, that this is a valid birth certificate. People have gone and examined it. There's the stamp on it. The governor of Hawaii, a Republican, has said publicly this is a valid birth certificate. He was born here in Hawaii in August 1961. 2 newspapers in Hawaii announced the birth at the time in August 1961. I mean, there's even Oliver Stone can't get a conspiracy going on 50 years ago to put out phony notices in the newspaper. The evidence is overwhelming. Now, does that mean we live in a world of doubt? You have to doubt things. But you have to doubt things as a journalist or as an attorney or as a citizen and ask questions and then say, what's the evidence? And if I were interviewing Trump on that and he started on this spiel, I'd say, what's your evidence? He'd say, shocking things are being, well, what? And if he went far enough, I'd say, you are the new Joe McCarthy. You are, through innuendo and statements, making declarations that have no basis. You have no evidence, right? Now, produce the evidence. Come back tomorrow and produce the evidence. It doesn't exist. In journalism, my old colleague Carl Bernstein calls this manufactured controversy. And it's exactly what it is. There's no controversy until somebody like Trump comes forward and says something, and journalism falls down on the job and says, oh, he said it, so that's evidence. Evidence is not an assertion by a public official. Evidence, we know what it is, and you can see it, and we use it every day. He should not be in the news on this issue. We should just say, you will have a forum, come back in 2 weeks, bring all your evidence, bring your witnesses, bring your pieces of paper, and so forth. And I talked to people who worked on this, because one of the other things Trump says is, oh, no one knew him at Columbia. No, there are all kinds of people who knew him. There are all kinds of stories. They have not, they don't have the prominence of some of the other stories and so forth. So is there a racist component to this doubt? Maybe. Let's hope not, quite frankly. But we will see. But this business of, and I really say it, and I've looked at this. Donald Trump's the new Joe McCarthy, and look at the press's response to McCarthy. It took too long for the press to catch on and say, wait a minute, there's nothing behind this. And actually, McCarthy went out and cited numbers. There are 61 or whatever the magic number was, communists in the State Department and so forth. And you want people to be able to say things like that, to go against the grain, against conventional wisdom, but you need to insist that the assertions be evidence-based. Okay, who else has? Sir? Yeah.
You weren't against the problems with secret government, given all of your experience over the years. If you could make any structural reforms or put safeguards in place to prevent as much as possible secret government from taking place, what would those be?
Okay, that's a good question, and that's the law. It's what reforms or laws would be put in place to deter secret government. You're never going to eliminate it, and some things the government should be able to debate in secrecy. I don't think there's a structural problem, quite frankly. I don't think it's like the Freedom of Information Act back in the 80s. I filed lots of them in the Reagan administration. 2 years ago, in the year 2009, I got a 20-year request answered. And it came back all redacted, or much of it redacted, went through channels of reporting, relationships of trust with sources. I actually had the whole document 20 years earlier and so on. We can function. The First Amendment is a glorious tool. And you just have to, I was telling this story the other day. When I was doing the fourth Bush book, there was a general who would not talk to me, and phone messages, emails, intermediaries, nothing. So I found out where he lived, and when's the best time to go visit a general at home unannounced without an appointment? Anyone? Saturday morning. Okay, that's a good idea. How about at night? Yeah, 8:15. Is because they haven't gone to bed unless they're George W. Bush. They're not. They probably have had dinner, not engaged. So I knock on the general's door. He comes to the door, and he looks at me. Goes, "You, are you still doing this shit?" Now, there's a moment of decision for me to kind of say I don't like the characterization of my work. But again, I return to sometimes the legitimate power of silence. I just stood there. I'm here, you know why, you got the message. I don't have to say that, I don't have to. And there was a moment of decision for him to say, slam the door or say I don't have time or something. And he looked at me and maybe, he could see the tears in my eyes or something like that. I don't think I had tears in my eyes. And he went, and 3 hours later, I left with the answers to the questions. People believe in the First Amendment. Time and time again, you find people who are involved in questionable or illegal behavior will talk. And so I think we've got the tools we need. It's a matter of deploying them with the method that is intensive. It also has to be, I can go talk to George Bush for hours, or Barack Obama, or all the people, or most of the people involved. I'm not carrying political baggage. I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I've been accused of being both. And you have to kind of convince people I take you as seriously as you take yourself. So I don't think we need structural reform. I think we need to energize the Congress in its power to investigate. I think it's been a real long time since the Watergate, Senate Watergate inquiry was the gold standard of investigations. If you look back, they found the Nixon tapes, they got testimony from everyone. It was quite an amazing, and the Congress is too timid about looking at what's really going on in the government. I think we have time for a couple more questions. Sir, stand up.
Who are the Woodwards and Bernsteins of today? actually putting in the time and effort to make the inquiries that should be made in a reporting?
There are lots of them. A colleague of mine at the Post, a woman, Dana Priest, she won the Pulitzer Prize a number of years ago for exposing the secret prisons that the CIA had where they were interrogating people. This was a case where George Bush called the editors of the Post to the Oval Office to say, don't print this story, and they printed it. They didn't give the locations because Bush argued if you name the countries, the diplomatic hell will ensue. But we printed the story. Then she and another reporter did the expose of Walter Reed Hospital and the conditions there, which was kind of news to the government. And Gates, the Secretary of Defense, fired the people who ran Walter Reed, the Secretary of the Army, as I recall, and so forth. So they are out there. They are doing a lot of really good work. What happens is, in the intelligence world, they talk about hard targets, and the hard targets are right now China, where it's hard to get information out of China with human sources, with technical sources. The hard target in Washington is the White House. As I say, they have this really masterful message control machine there, and you have to go after the hard targets. That's where the real center of power is. One more, what time do I get the hook? One more question, okay, who else? If you don't have one, I'm gonna ask a question of myself. And that is,
I'll ask you a question.
yeah.
What is the thing you worry about when you wake up?
What do I worry about when I wake up in the morning? Because I'm 68 now, my first worry is getting to the bathroom. Full disclosure. And the second is, what are the bastards hiding? And I don't mean that in an adversarial way. I mean that Republicans, Democrats, they're all hiding. There's something in the air handling system there in the White House that puts out these little particles that make people, we'll be secretive, we won't explain, we are not accountable, or we don't have to be accountable. Now, here's the, I've told this story a number of times, just want to spend a moment on it because it illustrates you don't get the answer. You get things wrong if you don't take the time, if there's not a method. And this goes back to 30 days after Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford was president. And some of you may recall Ford went on television on an early Sunday morning and announced he was giving Nixon a full pardon for Watergate. Now, Ford went on television early on that Sunday morning, hoping no one would notice. But it was widely noticed, but not by me. And I was asleep, and my colleague Carl Bernstein called me up, and he said, "Have you heard?" And I said, "I haven't heard anything." And Carl truly has the skill of saying what occurred with the fewest words in the most drama. Said, "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." And I was able, with all my experience, to decode that and figure out what happened. And I thought there was something smelly about the pardon, evidence, some of the deal, a question central to your lives, those of you in law school and practicing lawyers, teaching, what is justice? What is justice? Why does the guy at the top, Nixon, get off? 40 people go to jail, hundreds of people's lives are wrecked. Why a special ticket to freedom for Richard Nixon? And I thought this for years. I then, 25 years later, undertook one of my book projects called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate and the 5 presidents after Nixon, from Ford to Clinton. Called Gerald Ford up, said, "I want to interview you about the pardon." Surprisingly, he said, yes. I interviewed him for hours in New York City, in his home in Colorado, his main home in Rancho Mirage, California. I had the luxury of time again, the method, get the legal memos, interview everyone who's alive, read all the memoirs, look at the contemporary coverage, and then sort it out. And to make it short, and it was Ford who convinced me. He said, look, he did say he was offered a deal by Al Haig, claims, I think, correctly, that he rejected it. He said, I did not pardon Nixon for Nixon or for myself. I pardoned Nixon for the country. We had to get Watergate off the front page. We had it for years. If Nixon were further investigated, I mean, imagine if he was indicted, tried. I mean, imagine former president on trial. The trial of the century, for sure. Go to jail. We would have more years of this. He said, I had to preempt the process. We're in the Cold War was really serious business at that time in 1974. The economy was a wreck, and as he said, I had to have my own presidency. We had to move on. I had to relegate Nixon to history, where he belonged, and I realized that was exactly a gutsy thing to do, and I wrote that shadow. And Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of JFK, called me up and said, I've read this, my uncle Teddy Kennedy, we agree with that. We're going to give Gerald Ford the Profiles in Courage Award. So months later, at the Kennedy Library in Boston, is Teddy Kennedy saying, at the time of the pardon, he called the pardon almost a criminal act by Gerald Ford. And he said something you don't hear from human beings or politicians very often. He said, I was wrong. That when you look at this, it was an act of courage in the tradition of what JFK, the late president, wrote about in his book Profiles in Courage, of somebody in politics going against the grain and moving out of the well-worn path and saying, what needs to be done at this moment based on the evidence I have, and that I'm willing to steer out of my lane. I'm willing to do something that I think is right and at great risk. And so there Gerald Ford is accepting this beaming. And for me in my business, how sobering to see that you think you're sure something is one way. You subject it to the rigors of history, neutral inquiry, and it turns out to be exactly the opposite. What it causes you to do is step back and withhold judgment on all of these things. And the last point, I remember asked in the interviews, hours of interviews with George Bush, the second book I did was Plan of Attack, about how he decided to go to war in Iraq. And after 3.5 hours, over 2 days, he's standing in the Oval Office with his hands in his pockets. And I just asked, well, how do you think history's going to judge your Iraq war? And Bush takes his hands out and kind of shrugs like only Bush can and said, history, we won't know, we'll all be dead. Comforting thought. And I remember Elsa asked after the interview, how was the interview? I said, he answered all the questions, really important, but I have the ending to the book. And endings are really hard to find. And it's Bush saying, history, we won't know, we'll all be dead. Now he's ducking the question, but that's true. We don't know how it's going to look. The preponderance of evidence is that the Iraq war was unnecessary or a mistake, but it may turn out in history to look very different. Again, causes you to subvert judgment. And the last story, so around that time when Plan of Attack came out, I was giving a talk in Washington. The other speaker was Hillary Clinton, and she came up to me afterwards, and she's a senator at this point, gearing up to run for president, and she said, I quote from your book, Plan of Attack, all the time. In fact, I quote so often, I should pay you royalties. And I stupidly said, no, don't. worry. Didn't have my agent there. What do you quote? Said the ending when Bush says, "History we won't know, we'll all be dead." I said, "Why do you quote that?" He said, "You can't be president of the United States and talk like that." And gave this big spiel about, she said, "George Bush is a fatalist. You can't be a fatalist and be president of the United States. Somebody who kind of does what they think is right or appropriate and then just kind of throws in the towel. It's fatalism." And I pushed back and said, "Well, you know, Lincoln was a fatalist and seemed to do okay as president." She said, "No, you cannot think and talk like that, be president of the United States." And she started, I don't know that you've ever seen Hillary Clinton in quite emotionally exercised, almost a lamp-throwing mood. And she started saying, "You can't talk like that." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" She said, "Look, George Washington would never talk like that. Thomas Jefferson would never talk like that. Bill would never talk like that." And I was about, and I thought, oh, the new Mount Rushmore. Washington, Jefferson, Bill. And I was about to say something, and I thought, we won't know. We'll all be dead. Thank you very much.
So we're just going to take a brief break, and then for those who are